Dr. Sabrina Little, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you. I thought I would start with putting the viewers and listeners into your mind in a sense. And can you take us through when you had your first 100 plus mile competitive race? What was that day like? What was your mindset? What was even the preparation like leading up to it? What's that day like for you?
Yeah. So there's an expression in running, win slowly. So you kind of like prepare, really like invest your time and energy and attention. And then by the time you get to the race, that's the exciting part. So it's like, the training is the cooking, the race is the banquet. And when you get to the banquet, you're just excited. So most of the time when I'm really well prepared for a race, what I feel is just this kind of anticipation of just seeing what I've built over that time period. And yeah, a kind of enthusiasm, like a little bit of curiosity about where my limits are and just excited to draw closer to them. Like anytime if I'm feeling a little bit nervous, it probably means that my preparations were not very good. But when you like win slowly, when it happens through your training, you get on the start line and you're like, now is the moment. I'm so excited.
So you're really that, I mean, you can sort of envision it to that level of detail. I mean, so in other words, like are that's a lot of confidence. I mean, yes, you are training. So, and I'm sure you also know who your competitors are in a sense, right? So is that, does that go into it?
Yeah, honestly, like when I'm doing my training, I'm not thinking too much about my competition because I mean, all you can do is really control what you can control. And that's just figuring out the amount of training that you can personally absorb, and putting in that work, trying to direct your training to be compatible with whatever the course is and things like that. And so you're going to execute your race plan. You can't run someone else's race, particularly in a 100 miler. Like if you set off at their pace or just like do something that you haven't done in training, you are going to compromise your own racing. And so there's this kind of like quiet confidence in your own plan, but also it's like you can't do otherwise because you can only run your race, or else it's going to go wrong.
I'm sure you remember that first time. What was, I mean, to the level of detail, like what were you eating that day? What time of day was the race and the preparation leading up to it? Does that start? I'm sure it starts years before in one sense, but what was the sort of more immediate preparation like up to that point?
Yeah. So I can tell you two different versions of this. Like, so my first 100 miler was actually not a race, it was a fundraiser that I ran for the National Ovarian Cancer Coalition. And I ran it because my mom had cancer and she had been in remission for 3 years. And I like grand gestures. So I set out to run 100 miles as a fundraiser, for the Cancer Coalition. And I did not know that it was a sport at the time, and my longest training run leading up to it was about 16 or 18 miles, somewhere in that arena. So it was entirely unknown to me. And just like when I got past 16 miles, I mean, you have like 84 miles left. So just kind of like a fact finding mission, really just like enjoying myself, and having like a good time with my friends and family. When I finished that run, it was in the newspaper and people contacted me and said, that's one of the fastest 100-mile times in the country this year. And I thought, other people do this? So there was that, right? This kind of like unexpected experience. I'm participating in this thing that I didn't even know was a category of activity. By the time I like actually did my first race, I was training at William and Mary. I had just left the NCAA cross country and track team to try to go my own way in trail running. I was really curious and excited about it. And I was training with this group of boys who just like spoke life into me. Like they were very encouraging about my prospects. They were like, no one is training harder than you. Like, you are ready for this. And so I stood on that starting line with like probably way more confidence than I should have had, for my first race. And it went really well. I mean, honestly, like my longest runs leading into that one were probably closer to like 30 miles. And so I really did have that kind of like training in my legs at that time. But I also had people who really believed in me, and speaking life into someone, like that goes a long way. Like if you consistently affirm someone, they're going to go out into the world in strength. And I stood on that starting line like, this is it. I'm so excited. I was really ready.
Okay, we could do a whole podcast on those two races, and we're not going to do that. But I do want to touch on that's just, you pass over that detail like, yeah, it was 16 miles, and then I did 100. And what did it take actually to surpass what you had already done? What did it take physically and mentally to surpass what you had already done? And also, what made you come up with the number 100 and you hadn't heard of ultras at that point? That just seems mind blowing that that would even occur to you.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I don't know where the idea came from, but it was just kind of like a challenge. I like the idea of pushing limits, and I was curious about how far I could run. It's kind of like when you're a child and you think you could just run forever, right? And it's actually not the case. You could probably run like 2 miles or something, but that kind of like curiosity for what you could do, that's why I wanted to do it. And I'll say, like, honestly, I felt okay for 40, 50 miles. And then it's not like you become acutely injured or anything. It just feels like a dull toothache on your body. And so it's kind of like this growing discomfort, but you know that you can keep taking steps. And so that's what I did. And I was really grateful that I had a number of running friends and also my siblings come, like, they would run a couple miles with me and then switch out. So it was honestly just like a very fun day, despite the pain, the discomfort.
And you had enjoyed running like a lot up to that point, right? And you mentioned that in the book that, I mean, from an early age, that's something that I guess you naturally gravitated towards. It seems like there was this mix of talent, maybe genetics and build, but also will and resilience. Those had all, I guess, been cultivated at least somewhat over the course of your life up to that point. Is that right?
Yeah, right, right. It wasn't like couch to 100 mile. It was like I played elite development sports throughout my life. Like I starting at age 3, I started soccer and played on like the elite development teams age 7 through the rest of high school. I was on a traveling basketball team. I played softball and field hockey, and sometimes it was like 3 sports in the same season. And so I was calloused to the extent that a 19-year-old can be calloused in terms of like running. And I'm from Appalachia. The only thing to do there is to play sports. The only constructive thing to do there is to play sports. So I spent a lot of time like trail running or just hiking and being outside. So I did have like a very strong aerobic base. I lifted weights. I'm like pretty hardy physically, and so those are things that I think I had to my benefit, but also just honestly the curiosity for what I could do, that's played a big role in my running, and joy. It's like really hard to, I'm a pretty joyful person, like kind of like with a buoy, when you push a buoy down it always pops back up. That's kind of like the way that I'm wired. It's really hard to get me down, and that's been an asset in longer races because things go wrong all the time. And if you can just have a little bit of levity or lightness to you, and you're despair resistant, then I think that goes a long way. So yeah, I mean, it's these are things that kind of like feed into some of the conversations that come up in the book, because I do think that there are certain ways in which certain traits of character that can sustain you in ways that that are performance enhancing, that can support your ability to persevere.
For people who aren't aware of the different categories that you talk about for running, like you talk about trail running, you talk about 24-hour run, you talk about ultra marathons, can you give us a breakdown of difference between a marathon and an ultramarathon. And I mean, a 24-hour, I guess that's just a measurement of time, but how does that work? And maybe the different levels of competition. Once you get past a marathon, what's going on there with the different tiers and levels?
Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah, so running can mean any number of things. It's kind of like ping pong versus tennis. Like the structure is very similar, but it could mean very different things. So like the 100-meter dash on the track versus the 24-hour run, I mean, physically, you're doing the same thing, right? You're using your legs and you're trying to go as quickly as you can, but it looks very different in the training. Yeah, so there's like the track world, which is what most people encounter in their high schools and is like a very exciting Olympic sport at the moment. Tune in, lots going on there. And then there's like cross country, which is typically the fall sport where you're running on grass instead. Um, and then there's road running. Road running is oftentimes something that people participate in after collegiate days are over, but you could always participate in road races, and that's generally 5 kilometers through marathon. Marathon is 26.2 miles or 42 kilometers. But there's a world beyond that. Trail and ultra running. Trail running is just taking the discipline onto trails, like physical trails. And those can be short. Like sometimes those races are like half marathon long, but the premier event is generally regarded as the 100-mile. And then there are road ultra marathons, anything longer than 26.2 or the marathon distance. So 26.3 is technically an ultra marathon, and sometimes those are on roads. Oftentimes the 24-hour ones are small loops that you just run around and you try to see how far you can get in a 24-hour time period. So it's conceptually simple but difficult in execution, and they even go longer than that. Like right now there's a growing interest in 200 miles in the United States, and so more people are participating in those races as well. So really any kind of running, there are people who are interested in it. Any distance, any surface, there are people who run those things. And then like in terms of professional elite world, how that works is it's growing muddier these days in terms of like people who are very good at marketing online. They might get contracts even though their performances are not commensurate with like the highest levels of the field. But in general, if you're competing at a really high level, then you might be pursued by a sponsor. Generally, it's like a shoe sponsor, but then there are other non-endemic companies now taking interest in athletes as well and sponsoring them. So yeah, it's kind of a world that if you're in it and looking around, you figure things out. Probably from the outside. Anytime people ask, like they're like, "Wait, you can go professional in running?" Like it's like a weird thing. But yeah, it's the world that I have lived in for a good chunk of my life at this point.
What does it mean that you are ranked sixth in world history in the 24-hour run?
Yeah, so I was when I ran at the World Championships. So in the World Championships in 2013, I placed second. So I got the silver medal, and the woman who beat me had to break the world record to beat me. She was amazing. Her name is Mami Kudo, and it was the sixth best in world history at that moment. Since then, with the carbon plated shoes and just like increased interest the last few years, we've seen a lot of marks go down, so that doesn't stand anymore. But at the time, it was like it was a moment when I thought it affirmed for me the fact that I could do well in the sport.
What do you think has contributed to the rise of interest in this? I mean, I've mentioned to you personally that I only found out about the world of ultra running like a year ago or so. I just didn't even know that that level existed. And it seems like my ignorance is sort of common. And maybe that's because, as far as I know, it's not, those kinds of events are not like nationally televised. It's not that sort of thing. You sort of have to find out about it through other means. But I have a few ideas in mind of why the interest has increased. Um, but I want to hear your perspective, especially since 2013. I mean, we could say social media, but that's sort of an increase for almost anything. But in your experience, what has led to that increase of interest?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. One is there have been some really great storytellers in the sport in the past couple of decades. Like the book Born to Run came out a while ago. Dean Karnassus had another book. Right, there are two like really key books that became bestsellers that introduced people to the world of ultra running. So there's that. Yeah, that kind of like increased storytelling. I do think visibility on social media helps a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's a weird sport. I mean, to be honest, it's not the first thing I tell people about myself. Like when if they say, like, tell me about yourself. Like I might say I run, but I'm not gonna say I run this weird fringe thing. Um, Televising it is weird, right? Because say someone is running a 24-hour run around a track, like you're not going to see a lot happen. It's like watching, you know, something cook in the microwave or something. Like it's like not the most riveting thing happening, but the strength of the human spirit, like the power of will, like there are things taking place that are very exciting, but they're not quick things. They're not amenable to like a TikTok attention span culture. So yeah, I think there's like some resistance to it in terms of palatability for viewership. But yeah, I think we've had some really good storytellers. I think social media has helped in terms of just like introducing the world to some key players, and um, there have been some companies like Ironman has recently gotten into the world of ultra running and have brought a lot of money, and with that, eyes on the sport too. So there are bigger contracts. So a number of factors, things like that.
In my experience, the names that have been popping up within the last like couple years or so, it was David Goggins, Cameron Haynes, Courtney Dauwalter, who you mentioned in the book, Courtney, and her story is so great. She just blows my mind. So those were the names that I was exposed to, and they have a platform that's obviously very huge. But can you give us a sense of what the ultra community is like? And even maybe how some of those big names have either had an influence in the community, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or how do you understand that?
Yeah. All right. So one thing that's really amazing about the ultra community is that it is a community. I mean, I think if you look at professional track racing, it's 15 of the fastest people in the country on the track at once, and everybody else is in the stands. But in ultra races, they're lined up alongside the pros, right? And so there's a kind of accessibility, just like being there with the people. And there's also like a culture of giving back. So you'll often find the best athletes, like Courtney Dauwalter, volunteering at aid stations or helping to crew someone else, like carry their food from one station to the next and meet them and support them. So there's like that culture of like people talk about the trope of the lonely distance runner. It's not really a thing. You're not alone. Like there's no way that you could complete these events without the support of your family, but also the people who are there on race day. And I think that we're all very aware of that kind of dependence on others, and try to participate in that way. And so that's like a really special feature of the sport. It's interesting, like the other people that you name, um, um, they're more like on the the influencer side than on like the peak performance side. And so they're calling people in, which I think is really cool, because I think you can really be edified by having a regular running practice, and it can help you develop patience and perseverance and a little bit more like ability to self-govern that is profitable as citizens, right? Like I think that's great. Sometimes I worry about influencer culture in terms of the messages that are delivered. Things like no pain, no gain, pain is weakness leaving the body, like things that are very poor stewardship of your body. Um, like I think you get that from the influencer side, but then if you look at how the pros actually regard their bodies, like in general, you get more of a sustainable approach to the sport, because otherwise you are like your training is self-effacing, like you will be a flash in the pan and not be able to stay in the sport. So I think like we get a lot of really good exemplars from the pro athlete side, particularly athletes who've been there for a while. Generally they're people who highly regard their communities and are able to take good care of their bodies.
Good. I want to come back to that. But before that, I want to get a sense of your psychology when you're running one of those longer races. Maybe starting with a simple question. Do you listen to either music or audiobooks or something when you either, I guess, when you train? Is that something, or does that not help? How do you think about that? And maybe do other people, like, is that a common practice?
Yeah, it depends on a number of things. Well, first of all, if you're doing a USATF, United States Track and Field Association race, you are not allowed to listen to music. And the reason is it's a carryover from the track world, right? So if someone were competing in a track 5K and using headphones, they wouldn't be able to be aware of their surroundings adequately. And so it is a rule that also applies to the 100 mile. And so in those races, you cannot. But in like the lower level races or just like non-national, it could be like a high level competition, but not nationally affiliated or not IAU, International Association of Track and Field. You can. However, you might not want to because you're in the wilderness. And so if you want to be aware of bears and other like people who make things unsafe, it's often best not to have those, not to block out one of your senses. So often in training, I won't, just because if I'm using my training to prepare for races, then it's not a good idea to have this constant reinforcement like feeding into my brain. Like a part of my training is practicing being alone, like being alone with myself and my thoughts and finding comfort there. Um, there are times when I'm just doing an easy run or something and I really like listening to podcasts. So I'll listen to philosophy podcasts or like sermons I really like to, but nothing too serious, things that are more lighthearted in general. But yeah, so sometimes I do, but most of the time it's best just to be by myself.
Have you noticed a pattern in your psychology at different marks? For example, you know that at the, let's say, 20-mile mark, you're going to have to get into this certain state at the 40, at the 80. Are you even thinking about it in terms of blocks and your mindset, or how does that sort of pacing work?
Yeah, so different races have different benchmarks in terms of like points of difficulty and having to talk myself through rough times. Generally, for a 24-hour run, I try to get through the 100 just effortlessly and not introspect too much. Like, you don't want to think about the competition. You also don't want to like take too seriously any splits, like any of the times on the clock. You just want to get there as seamlessly as possible, because then you still have like 50 plus miles to run, and that's enough focus time. So generally in those events, get through the 100, then reassess things. Um, there are certain courses like certain courses that are like loop courses. There was one that I've run maybe 5 times, 100 miler, and it's broken down into 20-mile loops. And you just know, like, oh, I'm approaching the end of the loop. I'm approaching my people, my car. and so I'm going to move quickly through and stay on task, right? Because if you dwell in the possibility of stopping, like that's going to appeal to you after 20 miles, after however many. And so just like anticipating that there will be weaknesses. I think one thing that's helpful is knowing like there's life on the other side of the wall. Like people always talk about, I hit the wall and then it was all over for me. Well, there's life on the other side of the wall and there will be more walls. And so just like take one wall at a time, scale it, get past it, and just like leave open the possibility that things could turn around, because in general things don't always get worse, sometimes they get better. So yeah, once you despair and think like this is all over for me, my race is done, it is all over for you, right? It's harder to come back from feeling bad for yourself than it is to come back from feeling bad. Like if you feel bad, just like eat something, say hi to someone, think about something funny that happened, and then you can rebound. But if you feel bad for yourself, it's all over.
Yeah, that just seems like a lot of thoughts going on in a 24-hour period. I'm an overthinker, so it's hard for me to imagine, uh, quote unquote, entertaining myself for that long. It's probably not the right way to think about it. The other factor that I wanted to ask you about was I have never, I did cross country, but other than really that small mileage, I have never done a half marathon or a marathon with other people. And I've had people encourage me, hey, once you get out there with other people and there are other people, like other competitors and people sort of cheering you on, that acts as a motivating factor where you can actually, it carries you a little bit. And maybe there's something to that, but is that at your level, is that even an element or does that not even matter?
It definitely matters. I get way more out of myself when I have people competing. And yeah, so like what is competition? It's just striving together, right? And so if we are doing this shared task, like oftentimes it's not even a sense of like, oh, I'm competing against you. It's like something you're doing with someone for a large portion of those races, because you can't race for 100 miles, right? And so it's this bringing ourselves along. Yeah, and right. So yeah, having people there definitely helps. It also helps with the loneliness in the woods. And then I will say this, like sometimes when I'm having a hard time in races, like if I'm doing a bigger city race or something on the roads or something like that, oftentimes I remind myself to look at the faces of the people near me, because you can get this sense that I'm all alone in my misery. Like I'm the only one struggling now. I'm having a hard time. And then you look at the faces of the people around you and you're like, no, everybody else feels bad. We're just feeling bad together and we're still moving forward. And yeah, that's like oddly encouraging to know that you're not alone in your suffering. So yeah, that's like it's a tip that I often give to my students who are doing road races for the first time. They'll tell me like, "What is your advice?" And I'm like, "Look at the faces of the other people. You're not alone, even when you feel really bad."
You talk about in the book a runner who has sort of a psychological trick of smiling when he's running. Do you employ any sort of, I call them tricks. They're not really like that. They're whatever, motivators or something. I don't know how you categorize them, but do you have any of those psychological tricks that you do to get you past a certain point, including smiling maybe?
Yeah, that's so funny. I am not, so I am a joyful person, but I am not a smiley runner at all. In fact, in graduate school, my nickname was Stone Face because my thinking face is very severe. And I was like, where does that come from? Actually, that's my race face. And it just like shows up in the classroom. So no, I don't smile as Elias Kipchoge does, but I do like, what tricks do I employ? it's not a trick, but I just like am always eating, like always just having like a steady stream of something coming into my body, because like if you have that little lapse in your blood sugar, you are going to feel it emotionally. And so there's just like really taking care of your body as you go is like the biggest trick that I can say. Maybe this is a trick. When you feel like you need to slow down, speed up first. Why? Because it kind of like gets your stride moving again, but also then when you do slow down, you're slowing down from a faster pace. So like little things like that. Um, but mostly it's like trying to stay positive, not dwelling on the bad things. If you're thinking, if something feels bad, think about all the things that feel good, right? So yeah, like my quads are tight, but my hamstrings feel great. Thinking about those things instead.
I like that. I want to move on from tactics, but one last question on tactics. So if someone is listening to this and they're going, I've run a little bit, I didn't know about this upper bound of limits, maybe I want to try something. What are some of the necessities that someone has to have to train to get to that level? Because just in my experience, the amount of, pavement or trails that has to be in your vicinity is pretty substantial. You have to have access to all kinds of things. And just like you said, even the knowledge of fueling your body. So if you're, I'm sure you've done this, but if you're giving advice to someone who wants to sort of dip their toe in the water and see if that's something that they want to pursue, what do they have to have access to, both in knowledge and in just the physical terrain that's out there?
Yeah. I just always say consistency over flash. Like repeatedly putting in okay work is way better than having a few home run workouts, right? So just getting out with regularity, having a long run matters. In terms of terrain, I mean, to be honest, my terrain has always been dictated by whatever university I'm attending or working at in the moment. And I trained for the Trail World Championships, which had 18,000 feet of climbing in Central Texas. So you just get creative. I mean, you add things like more weight training or box jumps. You find the closest thing to a steep hill you can find and you run repetitions there. But there's no ideal training location. There's no ideal training. Everyone is going to stand on the starting line compromised in some way, like having, some key run not gone the way that they intended. And so just not having this myth of perfection that you have to arrive at, you can get pretty good racing results with pretty good training, and that should be the objective.
That's great advice. I'm going to take that to heart as I start running again. I want to talk about the role of exemplars, which you mentioned in the book quite a bit. And one way of asking that is, so when I was introduced to this world, I mentioned some of those names. You have your Cameron Haynes and your Goggins and some of those influencers that you mentioned. And at least part of their story on some level and in some cases was, so I'll mention David Goggins because he was the first one where I went, I didn't know that these sorts of races existed. I didn't know that this mindset could be applied in this way. But as I started listening to his story, I noticed, his personal life, and he admits this, was not going all that well as he achieved these incredible achievements in top performance, probably not in terms of speed, but just in terms of, and maybe that is the case, I forget his times, but just in terms of completing all these endurance tasks. And what I thought at the time was, and I want to hear your take on this, is, well, is it the case then that personal life achievements like a good marriage, family, and that sort of thing, maybe those are harder in some sense than these physical achievements like running 100 miles, because it didn't seem like he was, achieving to the level that he wanted to in his personal life. Is that am I wrong in looking at it that way? And how do you see the connection between, physical achievement and all the practices that you have to go through to achieve at that level, and then the other domains of life, like, family, marriage, just virtue in general? How do you connect those two things?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So, how do our formative practices in sport connect with the rest of our lives, right? So, should we expect that the perseverant runner can persevere in relationships or persevere in reading books or something like that? And I think that what we find is not always, right? Like the football player who practices fortitude on a regular basis on the football field is not necessarily the student with the most fortitude in the classroom, right? It doesn't always translate. I think there are some things that do cross over from sports pretty readily. And one is this kind of like emotional control piece, right? Like the ability to self govern your emotions. And I think that as distance runners, we have practice in down regulating our heightened emotions. Like if you're under distress, well, that is not going to be an asset in performance. Like you have to stay calm and meet out your energy well. And I see that as something that does cross over. I also see things like structural features of practice, like the fact that um, you have to show up. Like, say you have a bad performance, you still show up the next day for practice, right? And you continue doing that good work. Like having those kinds of features of your life where you don't just wallow. You know how to like take agency and act well. I think that that crosses over. I think other things that cross over that we might not be pleased with are vices, right? So if you're practicing being an imprudent person, like in your training and your racing or something like that, well, that could be something that crosses over into how you structure the rest of your life. Or say you're envious or something. Well, your relationships in the sport, I mean, that's not just confined to the sport. You have a habit of responding to another person's excellences with sorrow, right? Or asserting yourself. Like Kierkegaard calls it unhappy self assertion. Like you put yourself in that spot and you wish away their goodness or something like that. Um, so, yeah, like, I mean, there are two ways to answer the question. There are not everything that we practice in running is going to cross over. I think the things that will cross over are those things that are more connected to our agency and how we respond to setbacks and things like that. Um, and but if there are things that cross over, we should also be asking the question about, well, what are the bad things that I'm practicing in my sneakers on a regular basis that are going to inform the kind of person that I am in the rest of my life?
When you were beginning your PhD training, were there specifics that you could take from your running experience that you were self-consciously going, "Oh, this actually really does help in my PhD training. I'm glad I had these skills developing in the athletic world because I can really see it applying almost directly to the academic world."
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is just sitting quietly with yourself. It's like what I do in my running. I'm just me out there by myself. And that's what you do as an academic. Like you're just sitting in your study cubicle, working through something difficult, and you have to stay in place. That kind of stabilitas loci, that kind of positioning yourself to remain on task through difficulty. I think that's something that I've always practiced in sports, and it's impacted myself, my personality in as a scholar. And I think also like um, I'm like okay with if I'm not good at something, like I'm just going to keep working at it. I think that's another thing, that kind of like the distance runner mindset where you put in extra work and you just keep working until you get a little bit better. That kind of like putting your head down mentality, I think translates well from sport. Um, but yeah, I mean, like it's a good question. It's hard to pinpoint what came from where because my whole life I've been in school and my whole life I've been a runner, and they probably had like they're both part of my education as a human, and they're probably both impacting each other.
You have what I think is a really cool take on loneliness. You mentioned that in your answer just now, but the running world, especially long distances, can seem very lonely. You described that, but also, and I resonate with this, the academic world can seem very lonely as well. You're sitting there writing, you're trying to come up with these ideas. It's very cerebral. It's just kind of you and your brain trying, well, especially in philosophy, I should say. A lot of it can really just be this independent process where you kind of can't have other people around. Through conversations, that's going to come up, but really the hard work of writing is going to have to be done by you and you alone. So how do you think about loneliness in the athletic world and the academic world, dealing with it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, because I mean, sometimes when I'm out in the middle of a run, like I will get lonely, and I'll think like, if you weren't here, you would be alone also, right? Like the two things that you've chosen position you to sit quietly with your thoughts. Yeah. So I do see them in both cases. I think so. This is how I'll respond. So Thomas Aquinas talks about the two ways in which pride errs, and one is it's like forgetful of like the people that it depends on, right? Like, and so I think in my scholarship, like, am I really alone? Well, I'm engaging with all of these like voices, these people I really admire and respect. I've like had so many opportunities afforded to me by mentors and people who have like just invested time and attention. My parents have read countless terrible things that I've written over the years. So am I really alone? No, I'm like surrounded by this like crowd of people who love me and support me and have invested in me, and my doing my work is kind of like making good on that investment. And I feel similarly in running, like training partners who've called me to a higher standard, parents who fed me vegetables my whole life so that my body works well, like just like my husband watching kids a little bit longer so that I can get my training in. And so, yes, it's like a solitary thing in the moment, but it's never alone. Like I depend wholly on the people in my life who support me.
Has your study of psychology helped you in your mental states, both in the academic world and in the athletic world as well?
Yeah, so one thing that I study in moral psychology quite often is emotions, right? Like negative emotions, which are a big part of a running life. Like I always say, running is a marathon is a frown parade. It's like if you look at the faces of the people running in a marathon, no one's like, oh yeah, like having a good time. Like they are like it's an enriching part of the life, but it's also not like a smiley face moment. And so I guess one way in which psychology has formed my awareness of myself as an athlete is just the importance of those negative emotions, like the kind of guilt or like the shame or the sadness. Like they're an important part of how you see the world and see yourself, and so just valuing those. I think, yeah, like we've already talked a little bit about like the kind of like envy that can be in your relationships, like that is like an emotional response to someone's excellence, and there are better emotional responses to excellences. And so yeah, sometimes it just like provides me with a vocabulary, and shows me the ways in which I'm doing things poorly. But sometimes it like helps me to just like clarify what exactly I'm feeling. And then yeah, so like one thing, like when you're looking at emotions through like an ancient lens, like through Aristotle, your your emotions, it's not as though like, oh, you should never feel mad or you shouldn't feel sad. It's like they're supposed to be ordered toward their right objects. You're supposed to feel them in the right times, in the right ways, toward the right ends, and act suitably on those grounds. And so I think often, one way like knowing these things has informed my running is like knowing that my emotions are not always veridical, they're not always as they ought to be, and part of my training is learning to develop them toward the right objects and truly like be the governor of my emotions, not just having them happen to me.
When did philosophy enter the picture for you? Do you remember a time early on where you were just naturally interested in the big questions? When did those sorts of philosophical thoughts enter your mind?
Yeah, I went to a really good. I went to a public high school, but it was a good public high school where, in my history and literature classes, we read a fair amount of philosophy. So, like as a freshman, I read Montesquieu and Hobbes and Rousseau and things that I didn't know as philosophy. I knew them as history, and we read Divine Comedy and the Odyssey and things like that in literature. And so I had exposure in high school, but again, like I didn't know what philosophy was. In college, I went to study. I consider myself a science person. I wanted to do neuroscience because that was the new frontier and it was exciting. And I realized that a lot of the questions that I had were more philosophical than scientific in their basis. And I just fell in love with my philosophy classes. So I kind of, it was like liberal arts requirements afforded me a opportunity or like an obligation also, but an opportunity to take philosophy courses. And I just loved it. I loved being part of a tradition of inquiry and asking big questions that people thousands of years ago had asked. I'm like an analytical person, and I liked that side of philosophy. I liked the structure, the precision, things like that. And I liked writing. So I stuck around.
What percentage in your runs, how much are you thinking about something specific in philosophy, a problem that you have been working through, a paper that you want to write? Does that enter your mental life?
It does on some runs, right? If I'm running hard, not at all, right? I'm thinking about the next rep. I'm thinking about like just the pacing, things like that, like managing every moment. But if I'm doing something that's a little more relaxed or something like a long race, then I have ample time to think about my work. I know people carb load for marathons. I book load for marathons. So usually like there's something I'm excited to read. I'll read it right before a race and then I have something to chew on for however long. And it's kind of funny, like because all of those books that I've assigned to certain races, like I remember certain moments in the race are laced with the ideas that I was reading. So it's kind of like they're geographic, like the ideas are geographically positioned throughout the courses and things like that. Yeah, so that's been fun.
Was there a process of working through different ethical theories and then you found virtue theory, and given your background in endurance running, it just clicked? Or how did you find that subject matter that you were so drawn to?
Yeah, I think some of it, I was really fortunate to have some great professors in undergrad, and one in particular spent a long time on Aristotle with us and talking through what virtue is, what happiness is, and they were ideas that really captivated me. Another thing is just honestly, there's a kinship between what I'm doing athletically and virtue ethics, right? So, how do you acquire virtues? You acquire them by practice. You repeatedly do the excellent thing until it defines you in a stable way. And so, just like realizing that in my training, I was practicing certain dispositions, I was reinforcing certain dispositions that were not morally neutral, like they were normative. They're part of my character, and I'm solidifying them or weakening certain dispositions. Yeah, so just like realizing that sort of relationship between the two was something that I was noticing. And yeah, like so, I've had good teachers in virtue ethics, and I saw it as being very relevant to the process of training.
So when did the idea for a whole book emerge? When the examined run, I imagine that one answer could be sort of, the start of your running career, but when you started thinking about, I think I can put this into a book, how did that come about?
Yeah. So at first, I was very resistant to doing anything philosophical related to running, just because I liked my two spheres to be separate, and I didn't like that. Like I want to be a philosopher, not like not like, oh, this like philosopher who's like actually just a runner or something. Like I just wanted them to be established on their own terms. And so actually, the first day of graduate school, one of my professors pointed out this person who was in like some sports thing in the school and was like, you need to go talk to that person to do philosophy of sport. And I was like, absolutely not. I'm not interested in those questions. But then, like, honestly, running has given me a platform to talk a lot about my philosophical interests, and I just kept like talking about character. Like it just kept coming up, virtues and vices and their relevance. And I was coaching at the time and trying to come up with a way of helping to form my athletes in their character as we trained. So I was thinking critically about like how virtue and vice informed our athletic practice and how I could winsomely help them grow in virtue. And through that process, just kept wrestling with the same set of ideas. I was given a column on like the central hub in ultra running. It's called ironfar.com, and had just like since 2018 kind of been workshopping those sorts of ideas. At one point, I was interviewed on a podcast, and an editor from a big press was listening and invited me to submit a book proposal. And ultimately, I didn't end up going with that press, but just like thinking through the project, I became very excited about it and ended up following through. So it was something that I resisted, but slowly the ideas were just like coming together. I I wanted to write a book that I needed as a coach, right? And trying to bridge things together in terms of character and worries that I had in terms of how sometimes bad character is reinforced in sports. And yeah, I'm really grateful for having the opportunity to write it.
Someone who hasn't read the book yet and is thinking, right, how do you connect philosophy and running? I mean, I confess when I first heard of the book project, I had just this vague idea. I think I might know where you're going, but I don't know for sure. Maybe there's some aspect of purpose involved. You're right, character formation, but is that going to just be limited to, hey, don't cheat, in these competitions? It's obviously broader than that, but how did you conceive of the layout of the book and also the level, whether it's going to be, you wanted to talk to academics and say, hey, this should be taken seriously, or the popular level?
Yeah. Good question. So, yeah, I mean, often when I talk to my students about what ethics is, I ask them on their first day, they just give me a list of things they're not supposed to do. Like, this is ethics. Don't steal, don't lie, right? But then they don't present like this vision of what to do or to be instead. And so I felt that that was lacking in kind of the athletic space. Like bringing the conversation beyond just don't cheat, don't take drugs or something like that. Like that's often when we talk about ethics, right? When things have gone wrong, but without this kind of fuller vision of a rich human life and where athletics fits in. So that's the book I set out to write. And the book is structured in terms of key topics in virtue, in virtue theory, right? And so I have what a virtue is, how do you develop virtues? How do they impact performance? And then also vices, and then questions of like happiness and flourishing, like what does that mean, where do sports fit in, and then suffering. So they are like things that people think about all the time in sports, right? Like what where does running fit in, right? Like to a good life, like am I doing something badly, like what is transferring into my life, like those kinds of questions. So that's how it's structured. And then how did I set out? Right. So it's crossover. It's meant for runners, but also philosophers. And where did I pitch it? I pitched it at my students. Right. So if I were explaining these things to first or second year undergrads, what voice would I use? So it's accessible, it's broadly accessible. Um, Things are defined, you don't need a background, and that was important to me in writing it.
Why do you think philosophers, generally speaking, don't have a great track record in writing at that level, in producing more popular, accessible pieces?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, historically, it was not something that was prized by administrations, right? I mean, even in, if you look at requirements for tenure, it's mostly like academic writing and not public facing writing, which is unfortunate because I think like there are so people are really hungry to know things, right? Like people always have questions when they learn that I am a philosopher, and they want to share ideas and they want to ask questions and things like that. And so I think we do society a disservice by kind of like setting ourselves off on the side. And I also think it's a different set of skills. Like oftentimes, academic writing is like, it feels like defensive driving. Like, gotta avoid that counterexample. Let me define this in a precise way so you can't come after me. And then public writing is just so different. It's like showing instead of telling. It's like kind of you say less than rather than more, right? So it's yeah, it's just like a different kind of writing. It's a different kind of voice, and so I think maybe that skill set is not prized, and it's not part of our training as philosophers.
Has your teaching influenced your popular writing and vice versa?
Um, yeah, right. Yeah. So, I mean, I teach virtue ethics every semester. I know what their questions are. I know what's exciting to them. I know what jokes work because it's like every semester I try some jokes, you know? So yeah, certainly teaching has enhanced like when you interact with people and then you aim to write for those people, like you picture those people and that's enriching.
Can
Um,
I ask? Do you have any jokes that that you can give us on the spot that might work? And I'll, you're excused for maybe not making the same delivery that you would in the classroom. But since I teach, I'm kind of curious too. And you can say no for sure.
No, I definitely can't do any like unprompted, but they come up, you know.
Yeah.
Actually, my editor was amazing in writing the book. If ever he gave me pushback, it would be like, maybe let's take this joke out, you know, like, yeah. So definitely, I definitely like jokes. I had a great teacher, John Hare, during my master's, and he said, if you want your students to remember something, say it one way, say it a second way, and then make a joke, and they'll remember it. So I often employ humor when I can.
That's great advice. I on this podcast, I'm talking to at least a couple stand-up comics and thinking about what they can teach philosophy professors and teachers about delivery and even wordsmithing and sort of the impact of language. So I'm thinking about that pretty regularly.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. I can't wait to hear that.
What has been the role of your theological interests and training in these different capacities? I should ask about both in academics and also your athletic side.
Like my theological interest, you mean like faith commitment specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, right. I would probably feel like plankton if not for my my faith commitments. Like when you're striving or something like that, being firmly rooted in something, like for me, that's my Christian beliefs, right? Like knowing that, like relying on the fact that Christ did work and I can stand on it and I don't have to like earn my salvation, or I don't have to like prove my work that I'm secure in that. I think that is played a pivotal role in how I'm able to walk through the world and just like be at peace like in my life. In terms of like my scholarship, I mean, part of the reason that I was really attracted to philosophy in the first place was I liked Christian apologetics. I liked those kinds of arguments, and that was like a way in which, yeah, I was just like very excited to be in a philosophy classroom and to draw on like this entire tradition of thinking seriously about who God is and what we're doing here as people. Like, I think even if you're not a theist, like just knowing that a dominant answer throughout human history for why we're here is connected to some sense of divinity, I think it's probably, um, it probably would, it, it's probably good not to avoid, like, you don't want to avoid those questions, right? If you want a sense of probably where your students are coming from, but also like where a lot of um, like the foundations of a lot of thought throughout philosophical history have come from. But yeah, for me, it's like why I do the work that I do, why I'm interested in questions of character, thinking that the way we live our lives matter, and there's this idea of imago Dei, and like we're bearing Christ's image in some way, and so yeah, those are things that I take seriously, and yeah, so I guess it's like the answer is it's behind every door. Like you open a door, and my faith commitments are there, right? Like if you press me further, like it's all going to come back to my identity and where it's rooted.
As a virtue theorist, my guess is that you have thought about balance quite a bit, life balance quite a bit. And it seems like that is a necessary component for you because you have so many areas in your life. I mean, just the work life balance of being a professor and an academic, that alone is difficult often. But then you also have this athletic side, and yours in particular can have these crazy time commitments. So, what are some of the principles? How have you thought about as you have gone through, or as you have exhibited these different interests and also added on different roles, wife, mother? Um, how has that progression been for you in balancing all these different interests?
Yeah. So the way that I think about it is just in terms of order of loves. And so always knowing what the most important thing is to me and committing to that thing first. And so for me, um, my family is going to have priority over running every time and over my scholarship. And so just making sure that that order of loves is suitable to like my kids obviously deserve greater allegiance than my level of fitness or something like that, right? So it's not balance as much as it is like making sure that everything is in its proper place on a regular basis. In terms of like how I structure that in my day, I it's always dialectical, right? So I'm always in conversation with my husband about like, is it okay if I go for a run now, or should I be cleaning something? Like, is there something that I should be doing? Um, Always like checking back in terms of my calendar and other like things that are coming up, and making sure that um, the things that are the priority remain the priority. And it's really easy, I think, to have those priorities like shift in ways that they ought not shift, right? Because if you've ever been like training hard and your fitness is really coming together, like there's a kind of momentum and excitement, and you start to lean in that direction, or it starts to like dominate your thoughts in a way that isn't suitable to that thing. And so constantly just kind of checking yourself and standing back and seeing like, do I have well ordered loves? Am I giving something attention that is unmerited? Um, and sometimes it's like this is a season in which this becomes more important because I have this big race coming up, or I have this big like work project, or these students over here really need more time with me, and like being willing to shift those things into their proper place. It's not really practical guidance, but it's like what I what I do.
No, that's good. Just one detail. So, is there a baseline distance or time that to be you, you have to fit that in every day or almost every day.
In terms of training,
In terms
is
of
that what you're
running, yeah,
asking?
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I'm building up for a race, then 80 to 90 miles is like maximum what I'll do now. If I go any higher than that, I am not absorbing it. But most of my mileage, like through the week, it's going to average to right around just under 7 minutes per mile. So um, pace. So it's not as much time as people think it is, right? So that would be like 10 miles is 70 minutes. Like if someone were to drive to the gym and then drive back, like they would use the same or more time to get it done. And for the most part, like I think about running in terms of like it's the space between the couches in my life. Like I just fit it into the crevices of things. So it's not like the main activity. It's I try to make it invisible to the people in my life and fit it in when I can. And that's like a decisive shift from how I've done things in the past. Like previously, it was one of the couches. Now it's between the, it's a space between the couches. Um, and maybe one day it will be a couch again. But for now, like I just like in terms of like I have such young children and my academic career is like I've had more responsibilities over the past couple of years and I just like want to be present for those things. So running is like confined to a quieter role in my life.
What is it like to be around you when the Olympics are going on?
I'm like very enthusiastic about it. And honestly, yeah. So the Olympics, it's like excellence on display. You see their perseverance, you see like their excellence, and you see like how like that's why exemplars are so special, right? You see it as imitably attractive. Like you want to be excellent like them, and so yeah, like generally I'm a quieter person, but when but when there's the 5K on the track. Like, I get so excited. I just like start telling everybody in the room like their stories and like how this is part of their comeback and where they've been and where they're going. And yeah, I'm all about it. So exciting.
I would love for you to be a commentator at some point because I think that would be an interesting angle. I would watch that.
Yeah.
Is there is there an interest or are there any interests that we would be surprised that you have? I mean, we talked about, I mean, obviously academic profession and interest, running interest. Is there anything where we go, well, I just didn't expect that? What's number 3 or 4 on your list?
Oh my goodness. Well, okay. So, what is Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, he has this quote about like how he was like, I don't know, a man really fixed on his writing or something, but in the end of his life, he's coming back around to be this well rounded man, right? Like the most, he calls it the most limited of all specialists, the well rounded man. And that's kind of like what I would like to come back to eventually. I feel like there were some things that I was very invested in through my college years, which were like music. I took voice lessons through the end of college. I played violin and viola and youth symphonies, and music has just like been confined, relegated to this very quiet spot in my life. And I would love to just like, as my athletic career quiets down, just like reassume those sorts of things. Like I always feel like even when I'm listening to music now, like I still like do the fingering of the viola strings and like I just am hungry to reassume those as interests. Yeah.
That's great. I can't, that's another interest that we could talk a lot about. But what is next for you? What do you have either in the pipeline? I know you have the regular features that you do in all kinds of places where you write, but what kind of projects do you have lined up?
Yeah, I have a few. Well, okay, so I have 6 papers under review, and they're all just like various forms of like virtue development, and some of them are drawing on strands in the book that I should give more attention to in kind of like the critical analytic journal type form. So one that I'm working on today actually is on difficulty in terms of translation, right? So that very good question that you raised about what actually moves from the athletic practice into the rest of your life. I was reading last week, I was reading The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and he has some literature in there where he's talking about resilience and how in a play-based childhood, you have opportunities for resilience that are just not present if you're in a screen-based childhood. And he cites these things, all these studies about how resilience transfers. And so I'm looking at like resilience in particular. Is there something odd about that virtue? It's sometimes described as an emergent property, that it's like emergent on your agency. And so perhaps that's why it so readily transfers. Are there other virtues that we can expect transfer quite as well? And yeah, so it's just kind of like theoretical questions in that arena. So what should you expect? Some of more of the same, like these kinds of strands from the book. I just wrote a paper on how you develop the virtue of humor. so that's under review. Like, can you form it without squishing the thing, right? Because if you overthink humor, it destroys the joke. But maybe that's part of the developmental process. And yeah, so I'm excited to hear back about that one and some other things. So I like having my hands in lots of pots, and so you can expect like just more writing and in virtue development, kind of all over the place, though.
Please keep in touch on your work on humor, because I'm so interested in that. As I said, I'm kind of continually talking about that. I didn't expect to ask this. Two questions. One is a technical one. Is there a difference between anti-fragility and resilience that either Haidt talks about or in your mind is a distinction?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Anti-fragility. Yeah, he's drawing on that other guy's. So right. So for those who are not familiar, like he draws on, I forget the other man's work, where he's talking about how like um, there are certain systems, like an immune system, that require being taxed in certain ways, and through that like early taxing, then they function well. And he says a human is like this. You have to have adversity, little infelicities in your day, dirt, setbacks, and then later on you can function better. Yeah, and you're right. He kind of elides those two. Like he moves seamlessly between resilience and anti-fragility in a way that I think is, I mean, he doesn't capture like I'm relying on Nancy Snow's definition of resilience, which is normative and like um yeah, like I think is a little bit more precise than the general ways he's speaking about resilience. So that's like part of the pushback. Um but yeah, I can't really answer that question. He does like kind of combine them as though they're one thing, and I think that's resilience can mean more, right? It's like maintaining effective agency in the face of setbacks. It has this kind of like, it's connected to patience. There's a lot more going on in the virtue theory literature with it than the way that it's described kind of in a generalist sense in the book.
And what also prompted me to ask this question, you have a number of, you've written academic pieces in journals, and you're working on more of that. But what has been the reception of your work connecting these things in the academic community? Has it been mostly positive, mixed?
Just like the public writing that I do, or
The
do you mean the book
more the
specifically?
academic journal writing, when you're proposing these sorts of things in an academic setting. Well, I'll tell you, my sense of things is that maybe not every philosopher will kind of get what you're doing, but I could be. I hope I'm wrong on that. But I can imagine the reception being on a spectrum, let's say.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't feel that my work is like controversial or even novel, honestly. Like people kind of speak in this general way in which athletics has a role in forming your character. So let's just look at the process of what it is, right? I am not like a very controversial person. The most controversial thing that I've ever written is maybe shame is good, actually. Kind of like but it was like drawing on what Aristotle said and what's lost in the current conversations about shame. So I've not really encountered much pushback on any of my work yet. But maybe that'll be something to look forward to in the future. Or maybe it means like I'm such a small little person that most people are not reading. So something like that.
I doubt that. Sabrina Little, thank you. This was great. Where can people find you if they want to follow what you do? Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter/X as Sabrina B. Little. I'm on Instagram. I have a website. And if you're a runner, Strava, you can find all of my training on there.
Excellent. I appreciate it. It's not every day that I get to talk to someone who is combining philosophy and athleticism in the way you do. So I appreciate it. I want to point everyone again to the book, The Exam and Run. It has so many great insights, both in the philosophy world and in the athletic world. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.